Good morning. In case I still don't know many of you, I'm Greg McMillan, and I have a couple of phrases for all of us to think about. Nonprofit, public education, both primary and secondary, which means pretty much kindergarten through high school, 12th grade, and then government funded. Well, this sounds like how I grew up, elementary school, middle school, high school. But it also describes a different type of schooling system, which is the same slide, charter schools. Charter schools are an alternative to public schooling, public high schools, elementary schools, and middle schools that are available to anybody, which I know I'm going to be thinking about someday, but it's good for when we have children and we're thinking about what kind of schools that we want to send them to. I know nobody wants to think about having children yet because we're all like first and second years in college, and we just want to think about the weekend, not years in advance. But it's always good to know what's out there. And so that's why today I'm discussing the history of charter schools, like how they came around, who created them, what exactly a charter school is, and kind of some of its properties, and then some pros and cons so you can see both sides of the fence on how people feel about them. The original concept was credited to a man named Ray Boudet, I think that's how that's pronounced. In 1974, he wrote a paper called Education by Charter, in which he discussed his ideas for reorganizing school districts. Well, at the time, these weren't really relevant issues. The school districts were fine, schooling was fine, but this all changed in the 1980s when a paper called The Nation at Risk, it was a report that was published in the 1980s that discussed a lot of how Ted Kolderi, writer for Education Evolving, describes as the nation's problems. Well, whenever you have problems, you want to restructure these problems, make them better. And that's when Boudet came out in 1988 and published Education by Charter. And with his publishing, it became widely known and widely circulated, catching the attention of a very important man named Al Shanker, the American Federation of Teachers president, who, with Boudet's help, expanded on his ideas and then had them passed into law, making it legal for charter schools to be alive, in form. Well, this first started in Minnesota. They were the first state to formally put together a charter school and experiment with them, with California following suit very close after. Now that we know history of charter school, what is a charter school? I haven't really given you information on what it is. Charter schools, which the actual definition by dictionary.com, charter school is an autonomous public school created by a contract between a corporation or a sponsor, public school district oftentimes, and an organization or an organizer, such as parents, volunteers, administration from old schools. And with that, they have to create what's known as a charter. That's what the whole charter school principle is based off of, is a charter. And in that charter, it is defined how the school is going to run, how it's going to receive its funding, and its academic goals. Because without academic goals, you have nothing. But the difference between a charter school is that they have to stand up for those goals, or they're at risk of being shut down. Because charter schools are often much smaller, because it's harder to get a lot of kids going, and they have very limited space. They don't have huge high schools. They have often rented above building places. They have to find anything they can find to make their schools work. Now, this leads to a lot of problems. Lots of pros and cons. There we go. Pros. Gives families a choice in public schooling. Anybody can go to a public school, but you have to get into one. That's kind of the hard part. It's all free. There's no problems. And what's interesting is that there's different programs. A lot of times, charter schools I know in my town ran with a music and art curriculum as well. They wouldn't just have general education. They would have, my little brother took music class as a fourth grader and an art class, so that he was introduced to more topics than that. Often because they're a charter and they're still in the experimental stage, even though they've been around since the 90s, they're often held to a higher academic standard, so that if they don't meet that standard, they fail, and all the kids are kind of screwed, which kind of sucks. That's a bummer. And what's awesome is that they do have less oversight, so that they have more creative room. The teachers can identify what works for their students, how it can work, and how they can keep applying it to new students in the future. Now, with all the pros, you have to have cons. You got to see both sides of the fence. You can't just push someone in one way and not tell them what other people think as well. Well, it goes back to the small size. Yes, it's smaller, which is nice for teachers and students, smaller class sizes, but lots of kids are put on a lottery-based system to get in, which is exactly how it sounds. You get a number, and if your number gets called, you get access to the school. And if not, you're on the waiting list. There are hundreds of thousands of kids on waiting lists right now. I know in my town, my little brother's on a waiting list for almost 6 months. So it is very hard to get into a public school. Another con that goes into the oversight, which is both a pro and a con, is that with less oversight, there's a lot of fraud because their funding comes partly from the state and partly from fundraisers, but those funds are often abused. One example is that a state in Minnesota bought a sports car for their principal. Don't know why they would spend all the money on a sports car for their principal, but said school was then shut down because, as you can see, there was fraud and mismanagement. All right, in review, today we learned the history of charter schools. Ray Boudet was an innovator, what a charter school is, how it runs, what a charter, an actual charter for a school is, and then both the pros and the cons of different types of school systems. I hope you can all use this information, and someday, if you ever have children or relatives or neighbors or anybody who wants any information on other schooling options, can use this valuable knowledge. So I thank you for staying awake and happily interested in my information.